Hey, good morning, everyone. It is Brad Berzer, and I hope you guys are all doing well. Sorry, I had to check that and make sure I was recording, and I'm recording. So I hope you're all doing well. It is Monday and April 6th, but I'm recording this for Tuesday, April 7th class. Yes, I'm still kind of waking up. Sorry. So I hope all of you guys are doing well, and once again, I miss you, and yeah, I hope you're staying very safe. So, if you remember last week, we spent our time talking about the great C.S. Lewis, and yeah, Cal, how do we top C.S. Lewis? I mean, we've got the arguably greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century. Only Chesterton rivals him, and I think Chesterton, because of his conversion to Catholicism, makes him a bit more sectarian than we think of with Lewis, and so I would still give Lewis that title of greatest apologist of the 20th century. But today I want to talk about the person who was for a long time his closest friend. Not always. They had their ups and downs, I guess, like all friendships do. But their friendship mattered a lot. All friendships matter, of course, but this one matters in the sense that it kind of changes history. And this is the person who I would give the title of greatest myth maker of the 20th century. This is J.R.R. Tolkien, born in 1892 and passes away in 1973. Tolkien is one of those characters that I've had the privilege of studying almost all of my life. At age 52, I can say that I've been thinking about Tolkien at least for 41 years. Yeah, maybe even 42 years when I think about it, because I first read the Silmarillion, or at least parts of the Silmarillion. I didn't make it all the way through, but I first read them after the book came out. The book came out on September 15th of 1977. I had just turned 10. I turned 10 on September 6th. And my oldest brother, who was 8 years older than I was, turned 18. Maybe he's 7. No, he's 8 years older. Turned 18 on September 22nd or 23rd of 1977. And he got the Silmarillion for his birthday. And I opened that book because I loved the cover. I kept, in fact, my poor brother Kevin, I'm not sure if he even really saw the book for a bit because I just kind of took it. And I stared at that cover, the mountain path, and I wanted to dive into it. And I kind of did, not in terms of diving into the painting, but diving into that introduction, which is the creation of the world through the singing of Ilúvatar and the secret fire and all of that. And man, so good. So good. I can't ever look at Genesis now without thinking about that opening. My my own view of Genesis has been deeply shaped, for better or worse, by Tolkien's introduction and his singing of the world into creation. So as a kid, I read that so much and never really got past that singing of creation. But I read that so many times that it really affected my view of the world. It shaped it dramatically. So anyway, this is a long way of saying Tolkien has meant a lot to me. But I'll just throw the gauntlet down right at the beginning of this lecture. I really believe that Tolkien is not only the greatest myth maker of the 20th century, but I think that 500 years from now, he will be remembered as well as Dante and Virgil and Homer are remembered, as well as Milton is remembered. I think Tolkien will be seen as the figure of the 20th century who shapes our era in the way that historians imagine it, in the way they think about it. And I don't mean that historians are going to have this image of hobbits running around in the 20th century or in the 21st century. In the same way, when we read Dante, we don't actually take it literally and believe that Dante talked to this demon or that demon. It's poetic, it's mythic, it's a great image. And think about what we talked about last week with Lewis and imagination, and the imagination being that thing that comes from the soul as it doth magnify the Lord. Right? As the Lord looks at the soul, the glass darkly, in the spotless mirror, or the spotted mirror. Jesus is the spotless mirror, but the spotted mirror. And all those things, it is really through that idea of image that we get our own understanding of imagination. And Tolkien, throughout his whole life as a thinker and as a writer, would always speak in terms of saying that what he did with The Lord of the Rings, what he did with the Silmarillion, even with The Hobbit, was just mere recording, no invention, but recording. And he tried very hard to make sure that he recorded those stories properly as he saw them. So, again, I don't think we can take that literally. If so, we would want to put Tolkien into the insane asylum, I think. But he does mean it to a certain degree, that the very virtue and the story of the Lord of the Rings, the themes of the Lord of the Rings, that the very principles of the Lord of the Rings are in some way timeless. That he fully believes. And in that sense, he is really recording more than he is writing or inventing. And that was a great way for him, at least, to understand what he was doing. And we see that too in The Lord of the Rings, especially with the idea of Bilbo being the kind of scribe of all of this and the writer. And think about how he's translated some of the lays, and he's got the Red Book of Westmarch and all of that. You know, he is the great kind of scribe, and Tolkien has a very Bilbo-esque feel to him in all kinds of ways, or at least maybe we should say Bilbo has a very Tolkien-esque feel to him. So last week we spent our week talking about C.S. Lewis, and today I want to talk about Tolkien. I want to start off, though, by reading C.S. Lewis, which may seem somewhat unfair, but I think it'll make sense. And I want to read to you from one of Lewis's best books, and that what a crazy thing to say, one of his best books, because they're all really great. I guess they can't all be best, but they're all so good. And this is The Four Loves, and specifically his understanding of friendship. And he tells us that friendship is the least jealous of the four loves. That is, that in some way we find that we stand together as friends and we face the same thing as friends. And so let me read to you just a little bit of what he writes. To those, and they are now the majority, who see human life merely as a development and complication of animal life, all forms of behavior which cannot produce certificates of an animal origin and of survival value are suspect. He's talking, of course, about those who believe in evolution. Friendship certificates are not very satisfactory. Again, that outlook, which values the collective above the individual, necessarily disparages friendship. It is a relationship between men at the highest level of individuality. It withdraws men from collective togetherness, as surely as solitude itself could do, and more dangerously, for it withdraws them by twos and threes as dyads and triads. Some forms of democratic sentiment are naturally hostile to it because it is selective and an affair of the few. To say, these are my friends, implies those are not. For all these reasons, if a man believes as I do that the old estimate of friendship was the correct one, he can hardly write a chapter on it except as a rehabilitation. And then he tells us that while lovers are always talking to one another about their love, friends ever hardly talk about their friendship. Lovers are normally face-to-face, absorbed in each other. Friends, side by side, absorbed in their common interest. Above all, eros, while it lasts, is necessarily between two only. But two, far from being the necessary number for friendship, is not even the best. And the reason for this is important. Lamb says somewhere that if of three friends, A, B, and C, A should die, then B loses not only A, but A's part in C, while C loses not only A, but A's part in B. In each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can fully bring on. By myself, I am not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I love that element of Lewis. Lewis, who's so boisterous, Lewis, who's so full of himself at times, Lewis, who wants opinions floating around the room like grace itself. Here's Lewis in a moment of complete humility. In each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out. By myself, I am not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I want other lights than my own to show all his facets. Now that Charles is dead, I shall never again see Ronald's reaction to a specifically Caroline joke. Charles, of course, referring to Charles Williams, who died rather unexpectedly in the spring of 1945, and Ronald being J.R.R. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Hence, friendship is the least jealous of loves. Two friends delight to be joined by a third, and three by a fourth, if only the newcomer is qualified to be a real friend. They can then say, as the blessed souls say in Dante, here comes one who will augment our loves. For in this love to divide is not to take away. Of course, the scarcity of kindred souls, not to mention the practical considerations about the size of rooms and the audibility of voices, sets limits to the enlargement of the circle. But within those limits we possess each friend not less but more, as the number of those with whom we share him increases. In this, friendship exhibits a glorious nearness by resemblance to heaven itself, where the very multitude of the blessed, which no man can number, increases the fruition which each has of God, that communion of the saints, that mystery of the church. For every soul seeing him in her own way doubtless communicates that unique vision to all the rest. That, says an old author, is why the seraphim in Isaiah's vision are crying, holy, 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 to one another, as in Isaiah 6, verse 3. The more we thus share the heavenly bread between us, the more we all shall have. Right? So that idea of friendship is that reflection of the heavenly relationship. It is, in some way, the community of saints, the community of the church, the community of souls, of all past, present, and those yet to be born, in some mysterious incorporation of human life, as Edmund Burke would say. We have it all there. And Lewis describes that in his idea of friendship. Not just two, but three or four or more are gathered. And we understand that when we are together with one another, what I can say can bring out something from somebody that somebody else cannot get out of that person. But that person can get things out of the other person that I never could. And there is a humility in understanding that. Our friends are not our possessions. This is one of Lewis's most important points. They are not our possessions. They are our equals, and we do not possess each other. We possess the friendship, and in that friendship, we see further, and in that friendship, we see what is good, and in that friendship, we see what is true, and finally, we gather around what is beautiful. That is what friendship is. And so when we think about the friendship of Lewis and Tolkien, even though, as I said before, like all friendships, it has its problems, it is an enduring friendship that matters very, very greatly, not just to these two, but to all of their friends, first called the Coal-Biters and then the Inklings, and really to the entire world. When we imagine what this friendship produced with things like the Space Trilogy, all of Lewis's books, Narnia, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, The Silmarillion, all of the great studies that Tolkien put out on mythology, all of them come in some way or another from that friendship between Lewis and Tolkien. And that friendship, therefore, can change the world. Why? Because it is a shadow of the heavenly truth. It is a shadow of God's real grace to the community of saints. And therefore, our friendships must be taken very, very seriously. We must hone them, we must nurture them, and we must protect them. So Lewis and Tolkien meet in the mid 1920s at a faculty meeting. Lewis was less than impressed with Tolkien, but within about 3 years, they had become very fast friends. And by 1929, they recognize that they both have certain things in common that they love, that they consider true and good and beautiful. And in particular, as we talked about last week, they love things that are northern. They love the story of Baldr, the stories around Odin and Freya, around Thor. These stories and the idea of the sagas, both the sagas of the Volsungas and the sagas of the Icelanders, these kinds of things in the Prose Edda, it is these works that really tie together Lewis and Tolkien. And in 1929, after spending a long time talking one evening about all of the Norse gods and talking about the heroes and the stories and what those gods and stories and heroes meant to the two of them, Tolkien finally felt comfortable enough to give a poetic version of the Silmarillion to Lewis. Lewis went home and he devoured it. And he recognized at that point that Tolkien was indeed a true friend. And their friendship just blossomed to the point where they were almost inseparable between about 1929 and about 1939. So for roughly 2 years, these two men were inseparable. They really lived out what we just read there in On Friendship. And then something happened to their friendship that probably speaks well of Lewis, but doesn't speak so well of Tolkien. A third person emerged. There had been others, but never in the way there had been the Inklings, which were founded about 1931. But in that, Lewis and Tolkien were always the central figures, and their friendship was always the central friendship. But then in 1939, after about 3 years of correspondence with this man, Charles Williams showed up because he had to escape London because of the bombings, and Oxford University Press was moved from London to Oxford. And therefore, Charles Williams showed up in Oxford and he became a part of the Inklings. And at that point, there started to be a bit of a breakdown between Tolkien and Lewis. Tolkien did become jealous of this relationship that developed between Williams and Lewis. And of course, we saw in that story, in that essay, not story, but in that essay that we just read from, that there is the specifically Caroline, Charles's joke versus Ronald's joke. So Lewis saw the best coming out of both of them because of their friendship, but Tolkien, who could be very, very prickly on a personal basis, felt quite the opposite. Part of this wasn't simply mere jealousy that Lewis was giving his time to someone other than Tolkien. It also had to do with the fact that Charles Williams, even though a great figure in his own right, had really flirted with a lot of Gnosticism, a lot of mysticism, not necessarily in a healthy way. And he had flirted with these things for a long part of his life, and Tolkien always referred to him as the witch doctor, and Tolkien could be very, very sensitive, might be the best word, about evil. And not that that's a bad thing to be sensitive about, but he could be very hypersensitive about the possibility of evil. And he did not like the idea that someone had entered this friendship who had once been practicing magic and had studied the black arts and had studied tarot and all of the things that a mainstream Christian would regard as, well, with suspicion, to be sure. So that friendship was changed pretty dramatically between about 1939 and then Charles Williams' death in 1945. Tolkien and Lewis never fully recovered from that. And even the time period between about 1945 with Williams's death And 1949 was always a period of tension, even though the Inklings kept meeting. And then suddenly in October of 1949, after having existed since 1931, the Inklings just stopped. And there were no more meetings in Lewis's room at that point. The whole thing just kind of fell apart. There were still people who met at the Bird and the Baby on Tuesdays, but the Thursday night meetings, which were really the sacred part of the Inklings, was over. And Tolkien and Lewis just kept drifting apart then from 1949 really all the way up until 1963. If you'll remember back to last week, I did mention, and I think very importantly, that Tolkien was the one who, both through funding as well as through logistics, arranged for Lewis to get that very prestigious chair at Cambridge. But Lewis didn't know about that. He didn't know about Tolkien's efforts. And so there was still that element of friendship and respect there, but things had definitely fallen apart by that time. So that's something to keep in mind as we think about their relationship. But I'll come back to that. Right now I want to look at Tolkien, and I want to read to you from something that has nothing to do with Middle Earth, and yet it has everything to do with Middle Earth. I want to read from one of Tolkien's quasi-children's stories called Smith of Wootton Major. It's one of my favorite stories that Tolkien wrote. Again, what a crazy thing to say. They're all kind of my favorite. I don't think there's really anything that Tolkien ever wrote that I didn't like. Yeah, I'm actually positive of it. There's nothing he's written that I haven't been completely entranced by. But out of all those readings, out of all those things that Tolkien wrote, out of all of his writings, I really, really, really love Smith of Wootton Major. It is somewhat of a children's story, but a children's story in the way that The Hobbit is a children's story. It's extremely clever and has all kinds of ideas that flow through it about philosophy and about linguistics, right? About language, about ideas, and they're very serious ideas. Just like in The Hobbit, there are questions, very funny questions, about the meaning of language that are hidden within the certain forms of dialogue, say between the dragon and Bilbo. But Tolkien is really playing on some old concepts and really getting in some digs at some other people that he's had academic debates with within those conversations. The same thing is true in Smith of Wootton Major. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. That would actually take up more than our hour to read the whole thing. But I do want to read just a little bit of it. And the story, you guys can see here, I'm sure I'm violating all kinds of copyright by even showing you this. But if you can see here, this image, why is that backwards? That image, it's an image of a whole number of children sitting around a table, and it's a feast. Let's see if I can get that a little bit closer. And it's a feast around this cake. And it's a celebration of, if you can see the statue there on the cake, of a lady, a beautiful lady that they only have a kind of a brief, rough glimpse of. But the children there are to celebrate that lady. And you have the cook over here and his apprentice. And so within this fairy cake, and that's a fairy lady on top. Let me try and show you guys that again, because I don't think I can do this on copyright by making an image of this. But if you see right there, that's the little fairy lady where I've got my finger right there on top of the cake. So it's kind of important that you know who the fairy lady is. But around this cake, this fairy cake, all the children eat and they celebrate basically coming of age. And in that idea of the cake, well, I'll just read and I'll explain as I go along. So in my version here, this is page 17. At the feast, the cake stood in the middle of the long table inside a ring of 24 red candles. Its top rose into a small white mountain, up the sides of which grew little trees glittering as if with frost. And on its summit stood a tiny white figure on one foot with a snow maiden dancing, and in her hand was a minute wand of ice, sparkling with light. The children looked at it with wide eyes, and one or two clapped their hands, crying, "Isn't it pretty and fairy-like?" That delighted the cook, but the apprentice looked displeased. They were both present, the master to cut up the cake when the time came, and the apprentice to sharpen the knife and hand it to him. At last the cook took the knife and stepped up to the table. "I should tell you, my dears," he said, "that inside this lovely icing there is a cake made of many nice things to eat. But also stirred well in there are many pretty little things, trinkets and little coins and whatnot. And I'm told that if one is lucky to find it, one will be in your slice. There are 24 in the cake, so there should be one for each of you if the fairy queen plays fair. But she doesn't always do so. She's a tricky little creature. Just ask Mr. Prentice." The prentice turned away and studied the faces of the children. "No, I'm forgetting," said the cook. "There's 25 this evening. There's also a little silver star, a special magic one, or so Mr. Prentice says. So be careful. If you break one of your pretty front teeth on it, the magic star won't mend 'em. But I expect it's a specially lucky thing to find all the same. It was a good cake, and no one had any fault to find with it, except that it was no bigger than was needed. When it was all cut up, there was a large slice for each of the children, but nothing left over. No coming again. The slices soon disappeared, and every now and then a trinket or a coin was discovered. Some found one, some found two, some found none. For that is the way luck goes, whether there is a doll with a wand on the cake or not. But when the cake was all eaten, there was no sign of the magic star. "Bless me," said the cook. "Then it can't have been made of silver after all. It must have melted. Or perhaps Mr. Prentice was right and it really was magical. And it's not just vanished, but it's gone back to fairyland. Not a nice trick to play, I don't think." And he looked at Prentice with a smirk, but Prentice looked at him with dark eyes and did not smile at all. So, this image, I think about some found one, some found two, some found none. And think about the cake with its 24 pieces, but its 25 elements, right? This is the mansion with many rooms, with many houses inside. And this is not lost on Tolkien. He wrote this story as somewhat allegorical, which is interesting because Tolkien hated formal allegory. But he had been asked to write the introduction to a book by G.K. Chesterton. Tolkien really liked Chesterton, but he also thought that Chesterton had not gone far enough in trying to explain the nature of mythology, of myth, of faerie. And so, in only a way that Tolkien could, Tolkien was attempting to best Chesterton. And so he decides to write his own Chestertonian story. And that means that there has to be an allegorical element in it, even though Tolkien is not fond of allegory. So we find these elements, such as the cake representing the mansion. And we'll have to figure out what this little fairy princess or queen is. So let me continue. All the same, the silver star was indeed a fey star. The apprentice was not one to make mistakes about things of that sort. What had happened was that one of the boys at the feast had swallowed it without even noticing it. Although he had found a silver coin in his slice, he found one. And he had given it to Nell, the little girl next to him. She had looked so disappointed for finding nothing lucky in her slice. He sometimes wondered what had really become of the star, and did not know that it had remained with him tucked away in some place where it could not be felt, for that was what it was intended to do, and there it waited for a long time until its day came. So what did this little boy do? He only got one silver coin, but Nell, the girl next to him, got none. And so in an act of charity, unpremeditated, just raw charity, he gave his coin to her to make her feel better. The feast had been in midwinter, but it was now June, and the night was hardly dark at all. The boy got up before dawn, for he did not wish to sleep. It was, after all, his 10th birthday. He looked out of the window, and the world seemed quiet and expectant. A little breeze, cool and fragrant, stirred the walking trees, and then the dawn came, and far away he heard the dawn song of the birds beginning, growing as it came towards him, until it rushed over him, filling all the land around in the house and passing on like a wave of music into the west, as the sun rose above the rim of the world. It reminds me of faerie, he said to himself. But in faerie the people sing too. And then he began to sing, high and clear, in strange words that he seemed to know by heart. And in that moment the star fell out of his mouth, and he caught it on his open hand. It was bright silver now, glistening in the sunlight, but it quivered, and it rose a little out of his hand, and it was just about to fly away. And without thinking, he clapped his hand to his head, and there the star stayed in the middle of his forehead, and he wore it there for many years. Few people in the village noticed it, though it was not invisible to attentive eyes. But it became part of his face, and it did not usually shine at all. Some of its light passed into his eyes and his voice, which had begun to grow beautiful as soon as the star came to him, became ever more beautiful as he grew older. People liked to hear him speak, even if it was no more than a good morning. He became well known in his country, not only in his village, but in many others round about, for his good workmanship. His father was a smith, and he found himself in his craft and bettered it. Smithson, he was called while his father was still alive, and then just Smith. For by that time he was the best smith between far Easton and Westwood, and he could make all kinds of things of iron at his smithy. Most of them, of course, were plain and useful, meant for daily needs. Farm tools, carpenter's tools, kitchen tools, pots, pans, bars, bolts, hinges, pothooks, fire dogs, horseshoes, and the like. But they were strong and lasting. They also had a grace about them, being shapely in their kind, good to handle and to look at. But some things, when he had time, he made for delight. They were beautiful, for he could work iron into wonderful forms that looked as light and delicate as a spray of leaves in blossom, but kept the stern strength of iron, or seemed even stronger. Few could pass by one of the gates or lattices that he made without stopping to admire it. No one could pass through it once it was shut. He sang when he was making things of this sort, and when Smith began to sing, those nearby stopped their own work, and they came to his smithy to listen. Now think about that element of grace, right? Some got one, some got two, some got three, and some got none, but they are all residents within the mansion. And this is God's mysterious understanding of grace, the mysterious incorporation of grace, the mysterious economy of grace, in which God's gifts are distributed according to his will and his will alone. To one of us, one gift, to others, none. But the simple pleasure of being alive is a gift in and of itself. To another, 3 gifts, to another, 2. And this understanding of, well, what do we do with these gifts that God has given us? How do we understand them in their inequality? We understand that they are given to us for specific purposes, purposes that are not ours to understand. Even Smith here does not fully understand what this great gift means, that he carries the star upon his brow. He sings because he loves to sing, and yet his voice is augmented by the gift of grace. He works and crafts because he loves to work and craft, and yet his works and his crafts are augmented because of the gift of grace. Notice that when even he makes something simple, it is beautiful and it works. And when he makes a gate, it is not only gorgeous, it does not fail. There is a stoic excellence in everything that Smith does. In everything that we are called to do, there is the desire, and should be the desire, for a stoic excellence. We don't do something halfway when we do it. If we do a thing, we do it completely and wholly, or it is not done. And here we have Smith now, basically a normal person, but because of his act of charity as a young boy, he receives this delightful gift of grace. That was all that most people knew about him. It was enough indeed, and more than most men and women in the village achieved, even though there were many who were skilled and hard-working. But there was more to know, for Smith became acquainted with faerie, and some regions of it he knew as well as any mortal can. Though since too many had become like Noakes, he spoke of this to few people except to his wife and his children. His wife was Nell, to whom he had once given a silver coin, and his daughter was Nan, and his son was Ned. From them it could not have been kept secret anyway, for they sometimes saw the star shining on his forehead when he came back from one of the long walks that he would take alone now and then in the evening, and when he would return from his journey. Should sound very familiar to all of us, right? Bilbo, there and back. Frodo to Mordor and back. From time to time he would go off, sometimes walking, sometimes writing, and it was generally supposed that it was on business, and sometimes it was, and sometimes it wasn't. At any rate, not to get orders for work or to buy pig iron and charcoal and other supplies, though he attended to such things with care, and he knew how to turn an honest penny into twopence, as the saying went. But he had business of his own in faerie, and he was welcome there, for the star shone bright on his brow, and he was as safe as a mortal can ever be in that perilous country. The lesser evils avoided the star, and from the greater evils he was guarded. For that he was grateful, for he soon became wise and understood that the marvels of faerie cannot be approached without danger, and that many of the evils cannot be challenged without weapons of power too great for any mortal to wield. He remained a learner and an explorer, not a warrior. And though in time he could have forged weapons that in his own world would have had power enough to become the matter of great tales and be worth a king's ransom, he knew that in faerie they would have been of small account. So among all the things that he made, it is not remembered that he ever forged a sword or a spear or an arrowhead. Now, there are a lot of meanings in that. Smith doesn't forge weapons of war because he also doesn't believe in war. And that is a very Tolkien-esque way of looking at the world, too. Tolkien knew that war was real. He had served ably. He had served valiantly in World War I. And he would do it again if he had to. But he also knew the terrible cost that war brought. And he, as a survivor, knew what that guilt meant to him. In faerie at first, Smith walked for the most part quietly among the lesser folk and the gentler creatures in the woods and the meads of fair valleys, and by the bright waters in which at night strange stars shone and at dawn the gleaming peaks of far mountains were mirrored. Some of his briefer visits he spent looking only at one tree or one flower, but later in longer journeys he had seen things of both beauty and terror that he could not clearly remember nor report to his friends, though he knew that they dwelt deep in his heart. For some things he did not forget, and they remained in his mind as wonders and mysteries, as he often recalled. We can also think about Tolkien, seeing the images of Bilbo and of Frodo and of Sam and of Aragorn and of Gandalf, these precious, precious images that are not his, but he can wield briefly for a bit of time, and he can give us the record of what he saw in those places. When Smith began first to walk far without a guide, he thought he would discover the further bounds of the land, but great mountains rose before him, and going by long ways round them, he came at last to a desolate shore. He stood beside the sea of windless storm where the blue waves like snow-clad hills rose silently out of unlight to the long strand, bearing the white ships that return from battles on the dark marches of which men know nothing. He saw a great ship cast upon the land, and the waters fell back in foam without a sound. The elven mariners were tall and terrible. Their swords shone and their spears glinted, and a piercing light was in their eye. Suddenly they lifted up their voices in a song of triumph, and his heart was shaken with fear, and he fell upon his face, and they passed over him and were away in echoing fields. All right, I'm going to leave that there. But I love that image. What a great image. He goes into faerie, where he basically only interacts with the lesser and the gentle creatures. But one day he hears the elven warriors coming back from their battle on the dead marches. And what do? They sing in triumph. And of course, what we have here is an image of heavenly warfare. And without question, we see the forces of God against the forces of Satan. And the forces of God have, of course, taken the field. They have won, and they come back in triumph. And they pass by Smith as though he is not there, because, of course, they are so above his own understanding and beyond his own small store of wisdom. So in this world, he is about as wise and crafty in the best sense as they come. But in the next world, he knows next to nothing. And this is that image, right? We think about Moses speaking to the voice of God through the burning bush, right? That distance there. And here we have Smith encountering all of this as well. He does in one of the later parts of the story, and I would encourage you to read it. It's a story, Smith of Wooton Major, that you can read in 2 to 3 hours. It's a great story. I probably have already read at least a fourth of it to you. But there is one part in the story where he actually meets the Fairy Queen, and she is a lady of the utmost majesty. And he immediately is embarrassed because he remembers the little statue on top of the cake. And he says to her, "I'm so sorry that the way we know you is through this little trinket." And she just smiles and says, "It is so good to be remembered, even at such a level." And it's just this glorious moment of charity, very similar to what Alfred had when he met the Lady in White as he was trying to go into battle that we talked about last week with Chesterton. Okay, so what does all of this mean? What is Tolkien trying to get at? I think we can see pretty clearly the Chestertonian allegorical elements in Smith of Wooton Major. Those are pretty obvious, I think. We see the mansion, we see the idea of grace, we see the idea of work. All of those things come together for Tolkien in that story. But we need to think about what Tolkien means specifically by his ideas of faerie and what faerie is. Nobody wrote more on this in his day and age than did Tolkien. Tolkien gave a very famous speech. It's one of his most famous speeches, and he gave several. But he gave a very famous address at the University of St. Andrews in 1939, so right before World War II started. He gave this address called, not surprisingly, On Fairy Stories, where he tries to describe why it is important that we enter into a mythic understanding of the world. And is this actually escape from reality? And Tolkien's position is no, by looking at the things of faerie, just like what happened with Smith in Wooton Major, and as he went into faerie and saw these majestic and awful, right, in the best sense, awful things, these things that fill us with awe, so we too must look at the world in this way. And in particular, we must look at the human person, not merely as the eyes see, but as the soul would understand. We must look at another human person with the eyes of Christ. Now, granted, it will always be through a spotted mirror, a glass darkly, but still, we must try. So he begins his speech in 1939, and it's a long speech. I'm not going to read all of it by any means, but he begins by saying, "I propose to speak about faerie, though I am aware that this is a rash adventure. Faerie is a perilous land, and in it are pitfalls for the unwary and dungeons for the overbold. And overbold I may be accounted, For though I have been a lover of fairies since I learned to read, and have at times thought about them, I have not studied fairy stories professionally. I have been hardly more than a wandering explorer or trespasser in the land full of wonder, but not of information. For the realm of fairy story is wide, and deep, and high, and filled with many things. All manners of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril. Both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords, and in that realm a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gates should be shut and the keys be lost. And there we have the whole summation, 30 years earlier, of Smith of Wootton Major, right? 1939. I'm going to enter into this world, but this is a perilous world. And then he explains who has entered it before. And he says that there is a long history of entering into faerie. The Beowulf author had entered into faerie. The poetic author of the Poetic Edda, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda had entered into faerie. James Fenimore Cooper had entered into faerie in describing the American Indians. So there had been many people who had done this, but it is something that happens only every once in a while. And when it happens, we must take special note of what's going on. Now, Tolkien wants to make a serious academic point here as well. He tells us at one point into his speech that mythology should never be regarded, as he says, as a disease, because some people had argued that mythology was the disease of language. It was language that had mattered, and then mythology had come about as a kind of corruption of language itself. But Tolkien says mythology is not a disease at all, though it may, like all human things, become diseased. You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind. It would be more near the truth to say that languages are a disease of mythology. But language cannot all the same be dismissed. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world equal. Right? Let me repeat that. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world coeval, right? Equal, one to another. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, discriminating it from other things and finding it fair to look upon. Remember Aragorn? Are we alone the first to tread upon the green grass? But sees that it is green as well as being grass. But how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty that produced it was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in faerie is more potent than the adjective. And that is not surprising. Such incantations might indeed be said to be only another view of adjectives, a part of speech in mythical grammar. The mind that thought of light, heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make things heavy, light, and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and still rock into swift water. If it could be the one, it could be the other. It inevitably could be both. When we take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood, we have already an enchanter's power upon one plane, and the desire to wield the power that in the world external to our mind awakes. It does not follow that we shall use that power well upon any plane. It could be a disease. But we may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. We may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine, or we may cause woods to spring with silver leaves and rams to wear fleeces of gold, and put hot fire into the belly of the cold worm. But in such fantasy, as it is called, a new form is made. Faerie begins, and man becomes the sub-creator. We are not creators. Only God is a creator. But through his very gift, we become sub-creators. And we do it all the time. We do it in our language through the very grammatical fact of the adjective. I love that. Tolkien is brilliant, and the way that he explains these things is equally brilliant, right? What do we find? Again, it would be more near the truth to say that languages are a disease of mythology, but language cannot all the same be dismissed. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world equal. And so we must be able to find expression for our ideas. And sometimes those expressions can be done in mathematical formula. But there are other times, and especially because we live in the human condition, there are other times that we desperately need to speak, specifically in the idea of speaking in the story and fantasy, right? That matters. We have to be able to speak at times in the fantastic, because our fantastic is not merely an exaggeration of the truth. It is an attempt to get to the very essence of the truth without necessarily the physical eyes, but with the eyes of the soul, the mind's eye, to be able to see that. Tolkien tells us in this essay, and I'm going to keep reading from this essay, and for those of you who know that I can be very critical of the Peter Jackson films, and I apologize for that because I realize that so many of you have come to Tolkien and fantasy through the Peter Jackson films. So this is the 52-year-old speaking as a curmudgeon here, but here's why I'm not convinced that Tolkien can ever be put into film. He writes, "In human art, fantasy is a thing best left to words, to true literature. In painting, for instance, the visible presentation of the fantastic image is technically too easy. The hand tends to outrun the mind, even to overthrow it. Silliness or morbidity are frequent results. It is the misfortune that drama, an art fundamentally distinct from literature, should so commonly be considered together with it or as a branch of it. Among these misfortunes we may reckon the depreciation of fantasy. For in part at least, this depreciation is due to the natural desire of critics to cry up the forms of literature or imagination that they themselves innately or by training prefer. And criticism in the country that has produced so great a drama and possesses the works of William Shakespeare tends to be far too dramatic. But drama is naturally hostile to fantasy. Fantasy, even of the simplest kind, hardly ever succeeds in drama. When that is presented as it should be, visibly and audibly acted, fantastic forms are not to be counterfeited. Men dressed up as talking animals may achieve buffoonery or mimicry, but they do not achieve fantasy. This is, I think, well illustrated by the failure of that bastard form pantomime. The nearer it is to dramatized fairy story, the worse it is. It is only tolerable when the plot and its fantasy are reduced to a mere framework for farce, and no belief of any kind in any part of that performance is required or expected of anybody. This, of course, is partly due to the fact that the producers of drama have, or try to, work with a mechanism to represent either fantasy or magic. I once saw a so-called children's pantomime, The Straight Story of Puss in Boots, with even the metamorphosis of the ogre into a mouse. Had this been mechanically successful, it would either have terrified the spectators, or else would have just been a turn of high-class conjuring. And it was, though done with some ingenuity of lighting, disbelief had not so much to be suspended as hung, drawn, and quartered. Now, I'm not asking us necessarily to agree with Tolkien on this, but I do think we have to understand that he was extremely leery about putting fantasy into the visual arts. As he said, the only way we could ever really do it with any success is to make it unremittingly dark. That is, we would have to focus on the action, and we would have to focus on the elements of darkness and evil that we find within fairy story to give it a certain weight in the visual arts. It's probably something we could have an endless debate on, but I think it's worth considering, and certainly was part of Tolkien's own understanding. So I want to read from two more parts of On Fairy Stories. So I've read from this beginning and what does it mean to enter into fairy, but now I want to look at what he means by this in terms of the human person, and now we get into the idea of what does a thing look like versus what a thing actually is. What is the difference between the accidents and the essence, right? What is the difference between the appearance and the reality? He says, it is quite possible that our study may indeed become depressing. It is easy for the student to feel that with all his labor, he is collecting only a few leaves, many of them now torn or decayed from the countless foliage of the tree of tales with which the forest of days is carpeted. It seems vain to add to the litter, for who can design a new leaf? The patterns from bud to unfolding, and the colors upon from spring to autumn were all discovered by men long ago. But that is not entirely true. The seed of the tree can be replanted in almost any soil, even one so smoke-ridden as that of England. Spring is, of course, not really less beautiful because we have seen or heard of other like events. Like events never from the world's beginning to the world's end the same event. We've talked about this, and we did this when we were talking about T.S. Eliot and when we were talking about the Greek philosophers. There is always a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter, and it always returns to that first thing, spring. There's rebirth, there's renewal. Right now, we are in the period of Lent, and it's going to get darker and darker and darker. Yesterday, at least as I record this, was Palm Sunday, that moment of kind of false light. And now it will get darker as we move to the crucifixion, as we move to a 3 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, where our Lord and Savior put out his hands and died for all of us to be redeemed, right? It is going to get really dark. And then it's not going to just get dark as Jesus dies. When Jesus departs from this world and he descends into hell, it will be unbelievably dark. This is what we call Tenebrae, this darkness between that 3 in the afternoon when Jesus gives up the ghost, when his soul descends, when it ascends into heaven and then into hell, right? We have this moment and we have this darkness that lasts until the women come to the tomb on Sunday morning and they experience the greatest joy that has ever been experienced in this world. They discover that their Lord has risen. That is what this is about, this period of intense darkness. And yet, always with the seasons, always with the liturgy, there is always renewal. There is always redemption. There is always salvation at the end of it. Not one of us can change that or recreate it, not even Judas. Each leaf of oak and ash and thorn is a unique embodiment of the pattern, and for some this very year may be the embodiment, the first ever seen and recognized, though oaks have put forth leaves for countless generations of men. Now imagine, think of all the oak trees that have ever existed in the world, from acorn to tree to acorn again, and all the leaves that have ever been produced by an oak tree. No two leaves in the entire history of the world have ever been identical one to another. And yet we know, when we hold up the oak leaf versus the maple leaf, we know exactly that we're looking at an oak leaf. And yet it is unique in the same way that were we in class right now, and were I looking at each of your handsome and beautiful faces, I would see a unique person, but the pattern of humanity. And if, to use the famous phrase or the famous concept of Dr. Arnn, if at the moment in the middle of this lecture with 15 minutes left, a dog walked into the room, we may treat that dog with the utmost respect, but we would not treat it in the same way that we would treat one another, because the dog is not endowed with free will, and the dog is not a moral decision maker in the way that the human being is. The dog is beautiful. The dog is critical. The dog matters, but the dog does not matter at the level that the human being matters. And we have that unrepeatable center, each of us, of dignity and freedom. There will never be another one of us again. Each leaf, to repeat Tolkien, of oak and ash and thorn is a unique embodiment of the pattern, and for some this very year may be the embodiment, the first ever seen and recognized, though oaks have put forth leaves for countless generations of men. So we may look and we may see, we may have Isabel or Peter, or we may have Ryan, but we see them for the first time, not merely as Ryan, but as a human being in this long, beautifully gorgeous chain of human beings, the community of saints. We see him, but we see him not just as the eyes see him, but we see him bearing the weight of glory. We do not need despair of drawing because all lines must be either curved or straight, nor of painting because there are only 3 primary colors. We may indeed be older now, insofar as we are heirs in enjoyment or in practice of many generations of ancestors in the arts. In this inheritance of wealth, there may be a danger of boredom or of anxiety to be original, and that may lead to the distaste for fine drawing and delicate pattern and pretty colors, or else to mere manipulation and over-elaboration of old material, clever but heartless. And the true road of escape from such wariness is not to be found in the willfully awkward, clumsy, or misshapen, nor in making all things dark or unremittingly violent, nor in the mixing of colors on through subtlety to drabness, and the fantastical complication of shapes to the point of silliness, and on towards delirium. Before we reach such states, we need recovery. We should look at green again and be startled anew. The grass is green, that adjective, but not blinded by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves. This recovery faerie helps us make. In that sense, only a taste for them may make us or keep us childish. Right? And that element, let us see the thing for what it is. The next time you see the leaf of an oak tree, imagine you are looking at the unique pattern, the unique manifestation of an eternal pattern. And the next time you see Isabel, you are looking at a unique manifestation of God's love for us, the Imago Dei, right? That's what Tolkien is getting at. And if we can see it in the leaf, the majesty of the principle of unity in individuality, if we can see that, if we can see it in the leaf, we can see it in our fellow man. We can see it in our fellow person. And it does not matter if that person is so weighted down with sin and corruption and darkness and error and evil. The creature breathes because God has so willed it. And even if that creature is 99% evil, there is 1% grace with even the darkest things. And that matters for Tolkien. And so Tolkien concludes his academic lecture with one of the most beautiful statements we can ever imagine. he more or less chastises in a beautiful way his audience to think about what he's been talking about all along. He has not been talking about oak leaves. He has been talking about the human person, and how do we understand that? He says, let us imagine this idea that when we talk about myth or fantasy, those realists out there, those scientists, they tell us we're just being escapist and that we love our fantasy. This is what Tolkien responds. If we leave aside for a moment fantasy, I do not think that the reader or the maker of fairy stories need even be ashamed of the idea of escape, of archaism, or preferring not dragons but horses, castles, sailing ships, bows and arrows, not only elves, but knights and kings and priests. For it is, after all, possible for a rational man, after for reflection, quite unconnected with fairy story or romance, to arrive at the condemnation, implicit at least in the mere silence of escapist literature, of progressive things like factories, or machine guns, or bombs, that appear to be the most natural and inevitable, shall we say, inexorable products of progressivism. These too are violent and deadly, and the result of our fantasy, but not a good fantasy. And so what do we want? Tolkien says all true fantasy, properly understood, all mythology, ends in the opposite of a catastrophe. It ends in what we would call a euchatastrophe. That is a glorious moment. The consolation of the fairy tale is joy. It is the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly understood as the good catastrophe. The sudden joyous turns, for there is no end to any fairy tale. The story must always continue. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist, nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace never to be recounted upon recurring. It does not deny the existence of catastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of the existence is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat insofar as the Evangelium, the good news, will give us a fleeting glimpse of joy, joy beyond the bounds and walls of the world, that should be as poignant as grief. I would venture to say that approaching Christianity from this direction, and it has long been my feeling, indeed a joyous one, that God redeemed the corrupt, making little creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect as to all others of his strange nature. And I will say this plainly. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind which embraces all the essence of fairy. They move many marvels. They are artistic, beautiful, and moving. They are mythical in their perfection. They are self-contained in their significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. But this story has entered history and the primary world. The desire and aspiration of subcreation has been raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the story of the incarnation. The story begins and ends in supreme joy. It has preeminently the inner consistency of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its own merits. For the art of the story has the supremely convincing tone of primary art, that is, of creation. And to reject the Christ story leads either to sadness or to wrath. All of us should have guts like that, to speak our mind to an academic audience. Tolkien did, in 1939. He laid it out. This is mythology. Mythology and fantasy are not flights of fantasy. They are our attempt as fallen creatures to look at the reality of the thing, not to see merely the oak leaf, but to see the beautiful universal thing that God has created through the acorn, and that will fall in fall, but will re-arise in spring in an endless cycle, a cycle of grace. And if we can do that with the oak leaf, we can do that with our neighbor. And it doesn't matter if we're at war with our neighbor is also made in the image of God. Our neighbor has dignity, even if shrouded with sin and corruption. That is Tolkien's element. That is Tolkien's idea. We must grasp that truth. In other words, we have the high duty, when we see our neighbor, to see not merely a fellow fallen creature, but to see within that fallen creature the essence of the true reality, the Imago Dei, the image of Christ. Thanks, everyone. God bless. I'll see you in 2 days.